Using knowledge responsibly. As we grow in biblical knowledge, we are to use this knowledge in a loving, responsible way. Here's Gene.
Now, Paul addresses this, and he addresses an issue that was very unique to pagan cultures. And we'll see that. A situation that involved idolatry. And in these pagan cultures, this idolatry permeated religious activities, and particularly the food that was offered to the idols. This was very common in this pagan culture and in these pagan temples. Now, Paul is addressing that issue, another question that they raised, and Paul addresses it. He said, about food offered to idols. You ask about that? Well, he said, we know that we all have knowledge. But, he said, be careful, knowledge inflates with pride. He's not against knowledge, but if you have knowledge without love, it can lead to pride. Love is what builds up and enables you to use that knowledge in an appropriate way, in a godly way. When he gets down to verse 4 of this passage, he says, about eating food offered to idols then, we know that an idol is nothing in the world. You go down to that pagan temple, or you go up the hill to that temple where those 1,000 prostitutes would congregate. You go up there, there's only no God but one. There may be idols, but that's not God. In essence, by implication, he's saying, I just came from Athens before I came to Corinth. And he said the whole city was filled with idols. Everywhere I went, it was filled with idols. But that wasn't God, because there's only one God, and we know that. If you have knowledge, true knowledge, we know that. And so he goes on, down to verse 7. He says, however, not everyone has this knowledge. This knowledge about the fact that there is only one God. Even as believers, converted out of this mess, they're still confused. In fact, some have been so used to idolatry up till now, talking about Christians, that when they eat food offered to an idol, their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Now, let me just pause and say here that in these idol temples, there were three basic factors in relationship to the meat. And he's talking about meat here. Part of it was burned on the altar. That was very similar, by the way, to God's way of worship in the Old Testament. But here are pagan idols. Part of the meat was burned on the altar. Part of it was given to people who were there in the idol temple. In these orgies and gluttonous situations. That was meat. Part of it was offered to the idols. Part of it was served here in this den of iniquity, in a sense, from our point of view. But part of it was left over, and what was left over was taken out into the open marketplace, and it was sold. By the way, that's one reason why Paul said later, don't even ask whether it's been offered to an idol. Then you won't know that it's idolatrous meat unless somebody knows it and sees you buy it and then stumbles over it. But stumbling over it means falling into sin. And so Paul goes on and he explains, we're not inferior if we don't eat, he said. We're not better if we do eat. That's not the issue. But be careful that this right of yours in no way becomes a stumbling block to the weak, that is, causes this person to stumble and fall. So let me kind of conclude this, give you a conclusion. Though some of the Corinthians had the theological knowledge that meat offered to idols was not spiritually contaminated, they were not growing in God's love. They had a lot of knowledge, which was lifting them up in pride, but they weren't growing in God's love. In fact, their knowledge led to pride, which was a very common sin among the Corinthians. Paul addressed the pride and arrogance issue quite frequently in the opening chapters. Now, moving on to the other side, some of the Corinthians lacked this knowledge, that there is no God but one. Paul taught that. They gave lip service to that. In fact, maybe they even believed it, but they were so weak that they distorted that. coming out of that, all of that idolatry. And when they observed these people, when they observed some of the Corinthians buying and eating this meat, knowing that it had been offered to an idol, they followed suit, committed the sin of idolatry. Somehow it led them right back into that sin. And evidently some even reverted to their old pagan practices, which probably included immoral behavior. So Paul is saying here, be very careful, and then he concludes and he culminates this with verses 12 to 13 where he says, now when you sin like this against the brothers and sisters, that's generic, and wound their weak conscience, and the implication there in context is leads them into sin, you are sinning against Christ. In other words, you're not just sinning against that person, you're sinning against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother to fall, and there he's probably referring to the meat. He's generalizing, but it's the meat. If this meat causes my brother to fall, I'll never eat this meat again. It doesn't mean he's not going to eat meat again. In context, he'll never eat meat that's offered to idols again in that particular situation, causing his brother and sister to fall. By implication, he's saying there's other places I can buy meat, there's other places I can get meat. I don't have to eat meat offered to idols. Well, that was very common in those pagan cities. So he says, I will never eat that meat so that I won't cause my brother to fall. So Paul lays before them his own perspective, which is a biblical perspective, and that is to use our knowledge responsibly. Now let me read the principle again against the background of that passage. As we grow in biblical knowledge, and we should do that, that's part of growth, we are to use this knowledge in a loving, responsible way. Biblical knowledge only will not produce maturity, but practicing it through love is what gives us a reflection of maturity, which leads us on into maturity. Now the question is, why is it so important today for Christians to differentiate between what are simply judgmental attitudes and what are true concerns regarding cause another Christian to fall into sin? Now, Paul addresses this, by the way, in the book of Romans, and we covered that when we went through Romans. But in essence, there are some Christians today who interpret this by saying, what you're doing bothers me. That is not causing you to stumble. In fact, when some Christians say that, they're judging. They're judging others. And in some respects, they are the weaker brothers. I was talking with someone on the phone yesterday about particular Christians who developed this system of legalistic rules. And a lot of those legalistic rules come out of their own weak conscience and their own background and all the baggage. So they set up all these rules for themselves because of their own problems. And then they say if other people don't live up to all these rules, they're sinning against me or they're just sinning against God. And what Paul says in Romans 15 is, you're the weaker brother judging the stronger. And that's why it's very important to understand what the word stumbling means here. This means if I do something that causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, then I'd better be careful what I do in the presence of that particular individual. There's a certain relativity there that I think we have to be very cautious about. For example, if you were out to dinner and you knew that the person sitting across from you was an alcoholic, a recovering alcoholic, a person who really struggles with alcoholism, and you sit there and you drink wine in their presence, knowing that might cause them to go back into their alcoholism, well then Paul is saying, don't drink the wine in front of that individual. If you know that. Now I've been with people who've said, doesn't bother me. I'm beyond that. by God's grace. I'm accountable, and so forth. But all I'm saying is that if we deliberately know that there is a problem a Christian has where we take a liberty and a freedom that God has given us, and we don't care about that brother or sister, and the Corinthians didn't. They could care less if their brothers or sisters stumbled. And so Paul is addressing that kind of selfish issue in the lives of believers who cause their brother and sister to stumble. So I think we've got to be very, very careful about that particular issue as it applies, number one, on the weaker judging the strong, which sometimes is just, I don't like what you're doing, and that's not what Paul's talking about. That's just arrogance. That's immaturity. The other side is, don't do something you'll cause that brother to stumble, and you know it will, and you don't care. With your liberty, you don't care. That's what Paul is talking about here. Now, again, this opens up a whole other discussion we won't take time to develop, but Paul is not teaching license. He's not teaching that we should take freedoms that we shouldn't take in our lives that violate biblical principles, that violate biblical values. We talked about that last time. He's not talking about license in that sense. He's not talking about, he's not advocating license, and he certainly is not promoting legalism. And legalism is when we develop a set of rules and regulations that are beyond Scripture, and then we superimpose them on everybody else, even though there's no real biblical foundation for it, generally speaking. It's just a reflection of our weaker conscience. So we have to be very, very careful of bringing all these things into balance. And I found that in Scripture, that's one of the most important things you have to do, is to make sure that you get balance. Balance, which balance is a key word in so many issues when it comes to biblical truth. And that's not compromise. Balance is not compromise. I'm not advocating compromise. And right now, I'm again dealing with the subject of balance, because you can take and say, this is compromise. No, it's not compromise. What it is having a correct biblical perspective.